He had no appointment. He had no title. He had a creased coat that had once been good and a pair of hands that still smelled faintly of soap and metal. When the glass doors of Excellence Bank slid open that morning, the lobby swallowed him with its light. Marble so pale it felt like a challenge, chrome fixtures that reflected faces as if each one were a certificate. People moved around him with practiced care. They were polished, purposeful, practiced in the language of commerce. At the far end of the room, above a row of waiting customers, a brass plaque read Excellence Bank, Est, 1978. The letters were crisp, the kind of confidence that had learned to look away from whatever it did not want to see. Benedito stood a step inside the door, his palms folded over a small stack of folded papers. He looked like a man who had come for something simple, to be heard. The first person to see him was Larissa, the receptionist. She noticed the coat, the paper, the slow, unassuming way he scanned the lobby as if measuring where the conversation ought to be. She smiled automatically, the way bank receptionists smile at strangers whose business is a formality, a practiced, soft-lipped curve that asked nothing and signaled much. Benedito said quietly, "Good morning. I'd like to speak to someone from the board. I brought some documents." Larissa's smile shuddered. She glanced over her monitor. There were rules on her screen about visitors, about appointments. Her fingers, light and guarded, hovered over the intercom. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," he said, "I don't, but I do have papers that belong to the bank." Conversations shifted like weather. A woman in a tailored suit rose from a nearby bench, her heel making a small, precise noise on the marble. She watched him the way a cat watches the slow fall of a leaf. Priscilla, head of client relations and heir, by salary, by ambition, to Excellence's polished persona, leaned against the glass wall of the private banking wing. Her phone was half hidden in her palm. She did not bother to hide her smirk. The era of the man without an appointment was erasable. "Security," Larissa said into the speaker. Her voice was the thin wire that holds up a flag. It suggested authority without the weight. Benedito folded his papers closer to his chest, a photocopy of a faded check, a photograph where two younger faces grinned at a ribbon cutting, a business card with an inked name that time had softened. He did not make a scene. He did not raise his voice. The kind of dignity that cannot be taken by force is the kind that moves slowly. People sense it and mislabel it as weakness. The guard arrived, broad, uniform, crisp, his radio a constant whisper. He said the expected things. "Sir, you can't stand here." He used the language of policy like a shield. "I just wish to leave these," Benedito said, indicating the papers. "Tell them I'm here. I'll wait." Larissa's eyes darted to the security camera monitors, and then to the elegant flow of the morning. Clients with briefcases, a couple arguing quietly over a tablet, a child tugging her mother's sleeve. The lobby, practiced in exclusion, closed ranks like a cathedral. "We have visitors' policies," Larissa said, softer. "You can't wait here." An executive passing by gave a tight, invisible laugh that said everything. This was a scene you stamped down and moved from your memory. Priscilla, sharp-shouldered, hair pulled back like the reins of habit, stepped forward, exuding the tired patience of someone who spends mornings choosing to be cold. "Sir," she said, "we don't allow loitering. If you don't have an appointment, you need to leave." He did not argue. He bent, folded his papers again, and walked toward the door. When the brass handle hit his knuckles, he held it for a moment, as if testing the world on the hinge. He glanced once at Priscilla and offered a small smile that was neither supplicant nor sneer. "I'll come back," he said. He left. The lobby resumed its rhythm as if nothing had happened. When he returned the next morning, there was a small crowd, not of protesters or friends, but of curiosity's quiet cousins, employees who had seen yesterday and wanted to see whether persistence would become spectacle. He stood in roughly the same place, the sun cutting across the marble in steely bars. Larissa raised the intercom to her lips with the same professional hesitancy, but her eyes had already met his and carried a freight of hesitance. Curiosity had tilted toward unease. Security approached. Priscilla arrived in a different outfit, but with the same set jaw. This time, Priscilla's voice carried a new edge, sharpened by rumor. "Sir, again? We already asked you—" "Please," he said, "I have a few words with someone who can help me. I'm not here to cause trouble." "I'll call the police if you don't leave." She said it like a practiced instrument. It was a language of escalation tried and true. He smiled again, smile that kept its dignity, and started to speak when a man in a suit approached, a client with a quick, irritated glance. He pushed through the crowd, and in the motion of his impatience, bumped Benedito's shoulder. Papers fluttered to the floor. The man's annoyance flared, and then found purchase in an appraisal that the crowd seemed eager to agree with. "Get out, old man," he said, louder now, the sentence landing like a verdict in the room. The phrase itself could have been the end of the matter. It was not. The reception of those words bent the room. Some chuckled, some breathed a shocked silence, some continued with the small essential noises of their own lives. But Benedito simply bent to gather the papers. He did not curse, he did not plead. He retrieved every sheet, smoothed them with patient, careful hands. The image of his fingers against the paper, that tactile motion, held the attention of a few more eyes. Camilla, a young executive assistant standing just beyond the crowd, watched that small, precise care and felt, unexpectedly, the prick of something like shame. Camilla had joined Excellence Bank 3 years earlier, a bright, efficient presence who had learned to fold apology into the rhythm of emails and calendar invites. She had an empathy the bank prized but rarely activated. When people were uncomfortable around her, she would tend to them with small, precise generosity. She watched Benedito receive the insult with a calm that felt like a rebuke. It lodged in her. The third morning, he returned again. By then, gossip had built a scaffold around him. People came to the lobby with intentions half-honed, some out of hope for a story, some to confirm their own capacity for compassion, others to prove they belonged to the side that could decide who belonged. Benedito had a routine now. He neared the reception desk, placed his coat on a bench as if settling for a short wait. He took out a photograph. It was of a small crowd in front of a narrow building, yellowed at the edges. In the center of the photo, 2 figures cut a ribbon. One of them was a younger Benedito, hair thick and an apron slung over his shoulders, smiling in a way older faces sometimes forget. The other was a woman, Helena, cheekbones soft, eyes steady. She held a pair of scissors like a talisman. Behind them, a sign read, "Excellence Savings, First Branch, 1979. When he placed the photo on the bench, Larissa, from across the desk, saw the detail enough to lean forward. Her eyes brushed the corner of the image and lingered on the name printed faintly on the back, B.S. Andrade. There was a whisper, a small mental calculation. Perhaps this was not a derelict man. Perhaps this was someone with a history that required more than a polite removal. Priscilla noticed Larissa's tilt. She laughed once, a short, precise sound that asked the room to ignore curiosity. "He could be anyone," she said, loud enough to assert a verdict. "A story, a bother, someone looking for trouble." "And if he's not?" asked Marcio, a director of operations who had had his own rise through the bank's lattice. He was the sort of man who liked problems solved quickly, who mistook dismissal for moral clarity. Benedito folded his hands and waited. He had an air about him now that people could not dismiss as mere tatteredness. He carried the patience of someone who had practiced silence and used it like a tool. On the third morning, a delivery arrived, Joachim in a battered uniform, lugging a crate of promotional materials. He misjudged a step, his cart scraped against the marble, and a box slipped off. Unpacking into a low grumble, he fumbled with the tape and muttered. Someone in the crowd snorted. The man in the suit muttered about inconvenience. Joachim's face reddened. He bent to pick up the scattered brochures, curses threading into the humidity of the lobby. The cardboard was cheap. The words Excellence Bank gleamed from glossy pages. Benedito moved without thinking. He stepped forward and knelt beside Joachim, his hip popping from a decade of work, and together they righted the broken stack. He handed Joachim a pair of safety gloves from a satchel, simple, practical things. Joachim blinked, surprised, and then smiled in a way that was starting to feel rare in that lobby. He thanked Benedito with a voice that warmed. Priscilla looked on, the muscle at her jaw twitching. It was a small human moment, one small kindness, and yet it felt like a foreign element in a room that had practiced indifference. Camilla watched closely. In the contrast between Benedito's immediate care and the lobby's practiced distance, something began to crack for her. She found herself moving toward the bench without meaning to, picking up a brochure and, with no fanfare, handing it to Joachim. Small acts have a way of rearranging air. The executive's dismissiveness met with a private discomfort. "Why is he here?" Priscilla demanded later, leaning into a private conversation with Marcio and a few others. Her voice no longer had the same cocky absolute. "We cannot have people making scenes in the lobby. It reflects on us." "He insists he has papers," said Larissa quietly. "He claims they belong to the bank." She gestured to the photograph and the photocopy of an old ledger that now sat under the bench. People had stopped stepping around it. At a private table in the executive lounge, Priscilla flipped the photograph with a clinical air. The young Benedito smiled at the camera, as if pride were only a small thing. He had once been capable of it. There was an edge of something like recognition at the corner of her eyes. Excellence's history, like most institutional memories, had been edited. Names had been polished, roles recast. The bank's present had mastered the art of looking new. Benedito returned every morning for a week. The pattern became a ritual. He arrived, spoke to no one high in the bank's hierarchy, and waited with that patient wait. He never grew loud, he never caused an uproar, he simply existed, and the bank, built like a machine for forgetting, was forced to account for that presence. Between the fourth and fifth mornings, small things began to itch open. Benedito, with the humility of someone who knows the value of names, mentioned dates and details in the hallways between shifts. He spoke once, in a calm voice, to a security guard about the original paint color used in the first branch. He hummed an old slogan under his breath, and then, seeing the blank look on a young teller's face, recited the line that used to be printed on deposit slips. The words had been a memory of a time when the bank called itself something smaller and kinder. Camila overheard him say, in passing, the name of a first client. "Do you remember Señor Alves? He left his last coins with us when the rains came." A manager, Roberto, overheard as he passed and felt a small current of unease. He had been with the bank for 11 years and had signed off on policies that cut staff and centralized decisions. The sound of the old client's name felt like a pin in the side of his conscience. Leonardo, head of compliance, raised his brows. Knowledge is a dangerous thing in the hands of people who have been instructed to maintain a certain narrative. "It's odd he knows those things," Roberto muttered to Priscilla. "Institutional memory fades, files move, but he knows dates, he knows names we archive. Priscilla's first reaction hovered between annoyance and a different sensation, perturbation. Institutions fear inconvenient memories because those memories point to obligations, ethical, perhaps inconvenient. But the bank's economy of compassion had been shrunk down into measurable metrics: NPS scores, quarterly gains, brand alignment. Personal histories were messy and hard to report. For the executives, the next step was procedural. Leonardo recommended a cautious approach. Check whether the man had any legal claim, verify his identity. They could not, after all, be seen to ignore a potential shareholder or founder. But the bank was large and protocols were designed for cold efficiency. Their investigation moved like a machine. Email sent to the archives, a query to the legal team, a request to security to log the man's presence. In private, the executives joked about the spectacle. "Maybe he's an eccentric founding member with a taste for drama," Marcio said. Laughter like that tends to be a reflex and a refuge. Benedito noticed the change. He stood in the sunlight and watched faces tighten and then relax in alternating breaths. He had not come to win a contest of endurance. He had come because of a promise, a vow whispered by his wife, Elena, years ago when hospital visits and late-night arguments about margins had begun to puncture their conversations. Elena, who had once been a nurse and then, in their early years, a small force in the local community, had been the uncommon moral compass in his life. She had worried while he learned to run ledgers and count risk like prayers. She had insisted that if the bank ever forgot the human ledger, there must be a way to measure that loss. "You must promise me," she had said once, worry tightening her hands. "If you ever let the bank be something that kicks people when they fall, you must let me write something. If I'm gone and you find the bank is hard and cold, you will follow the paper. You will do as I say on those pages and make it right." He had promised. People make promises in small rooms and mean them like contracts because love becomes an ethic when someone asks you to be better. Helena wrote a short testament, 2 sealed letters, and instructions for a third to be opened only in a certain circumstance. She called it, in a laugh that held no drama, Helena's test. Benedito had kept those papers in a drawer for years. When Helena died, he had a decision: to put the letters in a safe place and pretend to have been swept forward with the currents of market logic, or to hold to the oath he'd made in the quiet kitchen over old coffee. He had chosen the promise, but to make her words work, he needed to know whether the bank, as it had grown, still honored the small human points Helena had insisted upon: dignity, respect, care. So he had devised a test that required proximity. He would come. He would present himself as one of the many faces that baked into the background of the modern financial institution. He would wait. It was not a stunt. It was a moral probe, simple as a litmus test. He understood full well how it might look: petty, eccentric, even pathetic. But the promise was not to other people. It was to a woman who had asked him to remember their beginning. As the bank's internal checks turned up nothing in the early days, no legal claim, no current official name match, an undercurrent of annoyance grew more combustible. In the staff room there were whispered bets. "He's probably a neighbor who wants a payout," said Leonardo, "or a family with delusions." The bank's machinery of self-protection designed narratives to make these intrusions small. But the machinery could not stop small, inconvenient facts from leaking out. Larissa, in a moment of idle curiosity, had pulled a leather-bound ledger from a back shelf the archives team had dusted off for the inquiry. The ledger was a memory of a single ledger that had kept track of the earliest depositors, their signatures curling in blue ink. On the ledger's inside cover, in a hand that had once been quick with numbers and slow with tenderness, was written, "Founding names, B.S. Andrade,
H. Andrade. The ledger's date matched the photograph on the bench. The archives team, checking for legal standing, found a press clipping in the paper files. A young couple had opened a modest savings office in a corner of the city, promising small loans and a place for trust. Their names were on the clipping. That afternoon, a private email arrived in Priscilla's inbox. Subject line, Founders. The message contained a scan of the clipping and the ledger. It had been forwarded from the archive by the junior archivist, who added beside it a gentle question, "Can we verify?" Priscilla's face changed as she read. She felt for a brief breath the pull of history. Institutions are stories as much as engines, and stories are made sticky by names. She tapped the desk with a neat nail and then pushed the documents across to Marcio. The two of them studied the images as if they were small archaeological finds. If the man in the lobby was indeed the B.S. Andrade, who once opened the first office, the story was a different order of thing. The bank had, over decades, become a monument independent of the people who had sown its first seeds. Recognition would imply responsibility. They met briefly in a glass conference room. The skyline behind them showed a city built to scale. "If he is who he says he is," Priscilla said, swallowing whatever immediate shame rose in her chest like bile, "we have an optics problem." Roberto, who had filed cost-cutting memos in neat stacks, tried on for size a different fear, shareholder reaction. "We handle this discreetly," he said. "We can't have rumors affecting performance." "Discreet," Leonardo repeated. The word tasted like a promise used in the wrong place. "We should verify identification and, if necessary, have someone speak with him." The problem was not for Benedito identification. He could produce the ledger, the photograph, the old company seal. He could bring forward a proof of his role and watch their expressions sharpen into understanding. But he had not come to shock them into guilt. He had come to prove something that would be destroyed by a single humiliating confrontation. Would the human heart of the bank answer the sight of a man who had been pushed aside? On a morning when rain made the marble shine like a darker mirror, the lobby filled with a different gravity. There were more faces now, not just employees, but clients and a few onlookers who had heard the rumor. A lawyer from the archives had been asked to verify the name. His confirmation was a small factual email. Archival records match B.S. Andrade. Security moved with purpose, a manila envelope in hand, habits supplanted by duty. Benedito sat on the bench and ate a sandwich he had carried in a cloth napkin. He watched the lobby like someone who had given up the desire to speed time. His hair had silver where it needed to shine. His coat had a small patch on the elbow, stitched by hand. When the lawyer's email floated into the private lines of the executive team, the lobby took on a fragile hush. Priscilla approached the desk. There was a motion toward protocol. A chairman had to be protected from embarrassment. A founder had to be recognized. Helplessness in that moment showed in the small panic at the corner of Priscilla's mouth. An assistant, Camilla, caught Benedito's eye and offered a small, unasked-for smile. It felt like a form of handshake between two people who recognized that something had shifted. Benedito nodded, as if affirming the motion. Priscilla strode toward him then, moving with the compact force of someone trained to control environments. Cameras angled, clients watched, the lobby's business rhythm held breath. For a moment it looked like a reconciliation might occur, a leader meeting a founder, apologies, a handshake, perhaps a deferential breakfast. Then something in Priscilla snapped. It was not a planned cruelty. It was an impatience that had run through boardrooms and had calcified into an instinct in a person who had built a career of uncompromising decisions. She had been embarrassed earlier by the man's presence. The knowledge that the bank's founding name might be attached to this ragged figure felt like an accusation aimed at the polished facade she cultivated. She did not meet the man. She met a version of herself and decided she would not be seen there. "Sir," she said, a little too loudly, "we've handled this. You need to leave now." Benedito closed his sandwich wrapper and looked at her. His face was alert but not surprised. He had seen the sharpness behind faces through the slow years. "I have a few papers to present," he said. "They were written by my wife. I promised her." "You don't get to make demands here," Priscilla snapped. Her voice carried beyond the reception desk. "This is a bank, not a theater for charity." The word charity fell into the lobby like a slap. A man in a suit who had been waiting for an appointment shifted his weight and laughed. The laugh multiplied into a host of small noises that were meant to shove the old man out of the room. The small, impatient cruelty of the lobby coalesced like a single movement. He stood. He did not shout. He did not grasp for dignity. He simply folded the sandwich and set it in his bag. Then, with the calmness of someone who had made room for an unpleasant moment, he opened his coat and extracted a metal cup from his bag. It was simple, a plastic office cup of water, the same kind you get in a staff kitchen. At the sight of it, someone in the back, a customer, said, "What's he doing?" Without a word, Priscilla stepped forward and, in a move that hardened instantly into a social crime, took the cup from his hand and flung it to the floor. Then, in a motion that shocked everyone present, she scooped another bucket, and with a quick, decisive action, she tipped cold water over the old man's head. It was done with the theatrical cruelty of someone who bought a public lesson. The water poured in a sheet down his gray hair, dashed across his shoulders, soaking the folds of his coat. The splash was loud in the polished space. People gasped. Some applauded in the relieved way of a crowd that thinks it has upheld order. Benedito stood within the rain like someone in a different season. His eyes were steady, and he raised one hand to his chest as if to steady his pulse. The water rolled down his temples and into the lines of his face. For a few beats, the lobby was an organism in collective motion, clients recoiling, Larissa with one hand over her mouth, Camilla taking a step forward as if to do what was right. The spread of humiliation should have consumed him. Instead, it seemed to contour his features into something the room had trouble naming, the axes of long endurance. He did not cry out. He did not make a spectacle. He simply looked at Priscilla, now flush with a rush of triumph, and spoke with a voice that did not belong to a man defeated by water. "My name is Benedito Silva Andrade," he said clearly, the syllables ringing off the marble like an official bell. "I am the founder of this bank. I have the papers Helena wrote." Silence slammed into the lobby like closing doors. The man who had shouted earlier felt something cool wash over his laugh and die. Priscilla's face lost color as the world reassembled. People turned slowly, as if the room were itself saying the same words aloud to see if they could be believed. Security, who had been prepared for a physical altercation, now stood frozen with the logistical unknowability of being wrong. Benedito reached into his inner coat pocket and produced, not theatrically but simply, a small leather folder. Inside were a few things: the photograph of the first branch, the leather-bound ledger page with his name on it, a card faded with use that bore the old company seal. He held them out with the motion of someone offering proof and not asking for absolution. The bank's logo, inked decades ago, had been crisp then. Time had softened it, but the line still said what it needed to. Priscilla's hand trembled as she reached for a look. Her finger brushed the paper. She saw her own signature on an internal memo decades later that built off what Benedito had begun. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen from the outside in. A security guard raised his phone and dialed. Someone, maybe an archivist, maybe a lawyer, had already confirmed in private that the ledger's handwriting matched archived records. The lobby's hum collapsed into a new kind of attention, verification. People leaned forward, not out of pity, but because the story now required a piece of evidence that matched an unusual claim. Benedito did not shout about rights or recite a litany against humiliation. He kept his hands visible, those old hands that had once held coins and scissors in a modest shop. Helena's name escaped him in a breath that felt like reverence. He placed a sealed envelope on the bench and looked directly at Priscilla. The envelope was thick, stamped with Helena's neat script, "For the board in the event." It bore, in ink that had not yet faded, a single instruction: to be opened if the bank ever ceased to honor human dignity at its doors. Camila felt the heat rising to her face. She remembered in the blink between water and confession the small kindness between Benedito and Joaquim. She had sat with policies and presentations, believing that numbers could fix everything. Now a man damp with water and bearing a photograph of a smaller, softer bank had undone her beliefs with quiet presence. A murmur spread. Clients who had minutes earlier attended to their own business found themselves watching the edges of their lives intersect with something older than a quarterly gain.
A man with a leather briefcase muttered, "So then who?" as if the name should settle matters. Security hovered like a hinge. Priscilla's mouth worked, and for a moment she looked at the man she had just drenched and saw the reflection of herself in the water that had run across his cheek. He spoke then, calmly, without a demand or a flourish. "My wife asked me to test the bank," he said. "She asked me to check whether we still treat people with dignity. She wrote letters, 2 to be opened if certain conditions were met, and 1 to be opened only by the board if the test failed." Someone in the back of the lobby inhaled sharply. The idea that a personal promise could be written into the bones of the bank felt almost quaint until the paper sat there, waiting, as proof. Priscilla swallowed. Her cheeks were flushed in the way of someone who has just discovered the foundation of their confidence might be unstable. "If this is a stunt," she began, but the words collapsed under the weight of the ledger's clear ink bearing the very names the bank had built upon. Benedito folded the wet fabric of his coat around the leather folder and set the sealed envelope in the center of the bench, as if it were a crucible. The room watched as the weight of history settled onto a small piece of stationery. Cameras traced the lines of a story that would be told later in paragraphs about dignity. In the present, the sound of water dripping from his beard into a floor polished to a shine made the whole thing unbearably immediate. At that moment, the bank's director of operations, Marcio, stepped toward Benedito as if to do a manly thing like make amends. "Sir," he said, in a voice that hoped to be conciliatory and practical at once, "if you are who you say you are, we owe you an apology. You should—" But Benedito raised a hand, not to signal forgiveness, but to mark the seriousness of the air. "There's a letter sealed by my wife," he said. "She asked me that the board read her words if, and only if, this bank failed the test she imagined. She asked me to wait until the moment when I saw whether we had forgotten to treat people as human beings, not as numbers." Priscilla's shoulders tightened. She could feel legal scenarios assembling in her mind, telephone calls to counsel, the optics team rehearsing statements. For a moment she imagined a headline, "Founder humiliated in lobby by bank executive." The thought caused a spasm of outrage and, at the same time, a strange protective instinct toward the bank's reputation. The lobby had fallen into a pause that felt like the breath before a storm. Some clients shuffled away, uneasy about being in the middle of a history that would involve their names and footnotes. Others stopped their conversations and stood as if a ceremony might commence. Cameras in the ceiling rotated slightly, their lenses catching the wet coat and the damp face of a man who had simply kept his promise. Benedito turned to the assembled staff, his expression neither triumphal nor pleading, only resolute. "I will leave the letters with you,"
he said softly. "I will not ask anything now. I asked only to be heard." The sealed envelope sat there like a small juridical thing, heavy with unspoken obligations. Priscilla's fingers brushed the paper again, then withdrew. She looked at Marcio, at Leonardo, at the cluster of managers who had built careers on decisions that sometimes removed the human element. In the silence that followed, something like embarrassment and reverence braided together. It was not a yes or no, but a moment in which the institution had been shown its reflection, the bank as it was, and the bank as it had once been. A client who had been waiting for a private meeting muttered, "This can't end here," as if to grant the moment permission to move forward. Security, now uncertain, took a step back. Camilla found herself standing near the bench, the place where the photograph lay shining like a memory. She felt a sudden urge to pick up the image and hold it, as if the act itself could prove the reality of the man's claim. Priscilla closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, the steady manager had become someone caught between defense and honesty. "We will look into this matter," she said. "We will—" The words failed her. Her mouth shaped an apology and had not yet found agreement on the terms. Benedito bowed his head as if to accept what was now possible. He could have demanded restitution. He could have told a story of a life wronged and demanded dramatic recompense. Instead, he was content to let the moment's moral weight find its place in the room's memory. He folded his wet coat once and tucked his papers into the leather folder again. "Thank you," he said to no one in particular, as if thanking the room for its attention to a promise. Then he stood, bent slightly at the knee, and walked toward the door. The lobby watched him leave. The motion felt like an exhale. The brass doors closed behind him with the same mechanical gentleness that had opened them. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city smelled like wet stone and cigarette smoke. A woman with a grocery bag smiled at him without knowing why. Benedito walked away from the glass as if he had never been a spectacle. Inside Excellence Bank, two things happened at once. A rumor began like a current under the polished decor, and a sealed piece of paper sat quietly on a bench with a name scrawled across it. The ledger had been produced. The evidence of founding names existed openly now, but a sealed envelope is also a decision point. To open it is to answer a question. The bank's guardians clustered around the bench like jurors with a case to consider. Priscilla looked at her hands and found them shaking. She had laughed. She had thrown water. The memory of her own actions sat on her chest like an accusation. For the first time, her authority felt fragile. She had always measured power in swift moves and decisive statements, but the ledger's ink had the property of making her decisions legible in the light of history. To protect the bank's image, she had exercised cruelty. The ledger made that cruelty visible. Camilla swallowed hard and sat down on the bench where the photograph had been. She picked up the little image of two young founders and turned it over. On the back, someone had scrawled a note, "For the future, from H.A." Her handwriting was steady, direct. It was the kind of thing that presses a conscience until it tells the truth. The executives clustered in the small conference room and exchanged cautious sentences. Legal opinion required, verification of archival materials, notification to the board. But beneath the practical phrases sat a more gnawing question. If the bank's founding name had belonged to a man now standing wet and calm in the rain, what did that say about the institution they had built? Priscilla left the conference room and stood for a long moment in the lobby where the bench still smelled faintly of old leather. Larissa watched her from behind the desk. The receptionist's eyes were softer now, as though they had learned to see people again. Priscilla's face was taut. She had always approved of order and disliked the disturbance of public embarrassment, but she had just ordered that public humiliation. She had dredged a small cruelty and discovered it reflected her image back at her. Benedito, outside, had walked a few blocks and then stopped at a small bench under an awning. He folded his hands and closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in a form of prayer that was not religious, only resolute. He had always believed in the slow work of making amends. He had kept promises to a woman who had asked him for better. Now he had placed the test in the hands of the bank's current leaders and left them with the envelope. He had not demanded immediate penance. He had demanded their conscience. Inside, Priscilla sat behind her desk late into the evening. The day's carefully stacked routine lay in pieces: emails that required damage control, a client who had withdrawn a tentative loan application, a junior staff member who had messaged that she was proud of Benedito's calm. The ledger had been scanned and placed in a folder. The sealed envelope still sat in the lobby, its weight marking the air. When the phone rang in the quiet hour, Priscilla picked it up and listened to the cautious legal phrasing. The board would need to convene. There would be statements. There would be talk of policy, and the optics team would craft a message. Yet beneath all those practicalities, the thing that pressed most urgently on her was the private knowledge that she had poured water over a man who had once opened the first branch with her bank's name on it. The memory of her own hands, wet, decisive, stained by the indignity she had just inflicted, sat heavy in Priscilla's throat. She paced once, twice, then sank into the chair behind her desk and stared at the blankness of the monitor as if the white screen might contain an answer. She kept replaying the arc of the morning, the way laughter had scattered like confetti among the polished people, the theatrical cruelty that had felt like a proof of authority, and then the ledger and the photograph, ink and paper that refused to be rearranged into the comfortable story she had been telling herself for years. Outside, the city lights blinked. Inside, the case files grew. Council emails arrived in hesitant bursts. The legal team needed time to vet the archival documents. The communications group drafted contingencies, and a junior archivist had dictated a precise timeline for verification. Protocol, it turned out, could be enlisted to delay conscience. Yet when the hours thinned and the floor emptied, Priscilla found herself alone with a fact she could not disclaim. She had poured water over the founder of the bank. She had done it because the man unsettled the tidy script she had written about what authority looked like. The ledger, the photograph, Helena's neat script on an envelope, these were not merely inconveniences. They were a mirror. At dawn, the board convened. The conference room's long table caught the light and threw it into thin, careful reflections. The directors assembled with the performance of a company used to turning crisis into minutes and minutes into statements. Marcio opened with the practicalities, a recitation of the archive's confirmations, and Leonardo presented a spreadsheet listing the possible legal implications and suggested steps for due process. The attorneys spoke in guarded syllables. Roberto spoke about shareholders with the tone of a man who had learned to frame morality as a variable in an economic model. Camila sat at the edge of the meeting, hands folded, her presence a small, steady counterweight. She had spent the night replaying the last gestures she had seen in the lobby, Benedito picking up scattered brochures, lending gloves to Joachim, answering a small child's smile with the kind of gentleness that had nothing to do with title. Those gestures had lodged inside her like a splinter that demanded extraction. "Open the envelope," she said quietly, before anyone could revert to defense. The suggestion surprised even her. There was an economy in that simple request, a commitment to face whatever consequence sat inside paper rather than hide behind counsel. Roberto hesitated. "We should verify identity first," he said. "There are protocols about sealed documents." Priscilla's jaw worked, and for once the practiced armor of rhetoric failed her. "We brought him into a position where the public could see him humiliated," she said, and the words felt like a confession.
"We cannot," she stopped. The sentence had been a bridge to nowhere. She felt the need to be seen in the way one feels the need to be forgiven and feared at the same time. Marcio placed his palms on the table. "Let's do this properly. Let counsel advise us, and then we'll open the envelope in the presence of legal and an HR representative." The board, with its accustomed respect for process, agreed. They arranged for a tense but formal procedure. An independent counsel would be present, a member of the archives would attest to the provenance of the ledger, and someone from external relations would take notes. It would be an opening that had to witness truth with more than spectacle. When the sealed envelope was carried in, it felt as if history had been folded into a small parcel that carried more weight than any of them expected. The legal advisor slit the envelope with the hesitant hand of a person handling evidence. The paper inside smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Elena's handwriting, steady, economical, ran across the page. "Dear Board," the letter began, and her voice arrived in the room as if she were standing at the far corner and speaking across time. She wrote not in condemnation, but in exact, precise insistence. She reminded them of a principle that had been practical once, of small kindnesses recorded in ledgers, and smiles served as currency. She called dignity the bank's first unrecorded asset. Then, with an austerity that cut cleanly through excuses, she outlined consequences if the bank failed a test she described, 2 letters to be opened if conditions arose, and a 3rd letter sealed to be opened by the board only if the founder's promise appeared to have been dishonored. Priscilla felt heat rise to her cheeks as the words unfolded. Here, in crisp sentences, Elena had offered not only diagnosis, but a plan. She named measures that would make dignity institutional rather than performative, a program she called Dignity that would create protocols for treating visitors and staff alike with respect, a day of humanity, a company-wide day when executives would work in entry-level positions to understand daily realities, a fund to support employees in crisis, and a memorial Elena, a modest physical space in the bank's first branch to remind everyone of the bank's origins. The letter requested that performance on these measures be tracked and audited by an independent committee, including community representatives. Elena's prose was not sentimental. She understood thrift and resource-limited compassion. She suggested plainly that a small percentage of profit might seed the fund, and an external auditor be contracted to measure outcomes, employee satisfaction scores, complaints reduction, community engagement metrics, and concrete outcomes in hiring and promotion practices for lower-income applicants. When the board reached the expanded annex of the envelope, there was a second packet, Benedito's instructions. He wrote in shorter strokes, with the tone of a man who had practiced restraint long enough to make each line deliberate. He recounted his promise to Helena and his method of testing the institution's heart. He asked that, if the test failed, the board consider implementing the measures Helena had defined, and that the board appoint an independent dignity committee to oversee change, with power to recommend personnel actions, policy changes, and funding disbursements. Benedito offered, in a practical paragraph, to endow a trust to provide initial funding for the Dignity Program and the Memorial Helena, provided the board would commit in writing to the measures and an independent audit. The room had a succession of small noises, the whisper of pages turning, a cough, someone clearing his throat. Priscilla held the last line of Benedito's note, an invitation that placed the institution at a moral fork. He did not demand retribution, he demanded accountability and institutional reconfiguration. The logic of his request echoed Helena's intent to make humane treatment structurally unavoidable. Roberto rubbed his temple. The board can't just agree to operational changes without careful financial modeling, he said, but his protest had the tired quality of a man who knew that economic mapping could be used to stall moral action. Camila leaned forward. If what they propose is concrete and measurable, and if Benedito is willing to seed it, we could pilot it in a few branches first. If there are improvements in employee retention and customer satisfaction, the numbers will follow. Leonardo, who had often treated policies as compliance boxes to be checked, looked at the ledger and then at Helena's letter. An independent audit, he repeated, savoring a phrase that to his ear legitimized the plan. We can design KPIs that don't just measure profit, but measure treatment. Complaints per 1,000 customers, employee reports of dignity incidents, turnaround time for assistance requests, those are tangible. A silence followed, one that had an edge of resolve. The board could continue to debate optics and risk, or they could accept the small envelope's invitation to change. Priscilla's hands trembled when she spoke. I acted wrongly, she said, not a polished apology, but an admission that shook free of jargon. I humiliated a man I should have welcomed with respect. It was an instinct to protect the bank's image. I see now that such instinct can become cruelty. Her words landed in a room that had not heard such plainness in a long time. The legal counsel did not leap into objection. Instead, he suggested that any immediate personnel actions be considered in tandem with HR to avoid knee-jerk decisions. Benedito's envelope had not demanded specific firings. It demanded policy, accountability, and the establishment of a process that would measure and hold people to standards. In the end, the board did what institutions often do when confronted with a moral hinge. They appointed a committee. The committee's charter was purposeful and unusually inclusive. 2 board members, the head of HR, a representative from community partners, a representative of frontline staff selected by employee vote, an independent auditor, and an ombudsman with the power to receive complaints confidentially. The Dignity Committee, they promised, would craft metrics, oversee a pilot rollout of the Dignity program, and report publicly on progress every quarter. A trust would be established with Benedito's initial endowment to fund the Memorial Helena and the support fund. The board would publish a public apology and commit to structural changes with enumerated targets. But words are fragile. Benedito had not stayed for the bureaucratic comfort of declarations. He had walked away with the calm of someone who knew how to let consequences do the work. When Priscilla authorized an interim meeting with him, an attempt at an immediate human-level reconciliation, Benedito accepted on his own terms. They met the next afternoon in a modest conference room with a single pot of tea placed between them. Camila asked to be present. Benedito sat with the grave posture of a man who had lived through generations. His damp coat was long gone, replaced by a sensible jacket, but the memory of that day hovered between them like a question that would not be answered by a mere apology. Priscilla opened with a sentence that could have been press release language, but instead it came out raw and private. I am sorry. I acted out of fear of what being seen as weak might do to the bank. Benedito considered her. His face held no drama. Fear is the engine of many bad choices, he said. But fear can be acknowledged, and mistakes can be the place from which growth begins, if we allow the work. She swallowed. The wall of defense she had always used, the one built of deadlines and stakeholder expectations, felt thin when juxtaposed with a man who had once cut a ribbon with account ledgers in his pocket. Tell me what you will do, Benedito said simply.
So she told him, haltingly at first, and then with more detail, the formation of the Dignity Committee, the intended metrics, the commitment to start a pilot in the original branch and 3 urban branches with high foot traffic, the fund's initial capital, and the public apology to be issued by the bank. She spoke of procedural reviews for security protocols to ensure visitors are treated respectfully and training focused on empathy and ethical leadership. She admitted she had to confront her own behavior and promised to volunteer in the pilot branches for the Day of Humanity. Benedito nodded. He accepted the apology with a gravity that was not theatrical. He said, "Apology matters, but you must understand what I promised Helena. This is not about my hurt. It is about preventing a pattern."
If we commit and measure, really measure, and if the committee has teeth, then what we do now could last. Camila, who had come to the meeting with her palms sweating, watched the exchange with a careful hope. She offered her name to serve on the Dignity Committee as a staff representative. Her offer was small but significant, a bridge between the executive world and the lived realities of frontline employees. Priscilla reached across the table and took the old man's hand, not as a parent taking a child's, but as 2 adults recognizing the cost of governance. "We will begin Monday," she said. "We will open the pilot and publish our timeline." Benedito's eyes softened. "Then let the work be visible," he said. "If this is to be true, it must be tracked in a way that cannot be dressed or redirected by public relations." In the weeks that followed, the bank moved with an awkward momentum. There were meetings that revived old defensiveness. There were staff members who scoffed at the suddenness of attention. There were shareholders who demanded careful financial projections before supporting the trust. But there was also movement that could not be staged. The Dignity Committee, a clumsy, imperfect body at first, began to do what it had been designed to do: listen, codify, and then test. Their first task was to write the Dignity Code, a short, direct document that defined unacceptable behaviors and articulated procedures for how visitors and staff should be treated. It required mandatory training for every employee, including the executive team, and created a confidential channel for reporting dignity incidents that promised anonymity and protection from retaliation. Importantly, the committee added a clause: corrective measures coupled with restorative opportunities. People who committed dignity offenses would be required to participate in restorative practices, direct dialogue with affected parties, supervised community work, and training before a judgment about their fit in the institution could be finalized. The idea was not to be soft on wrongdoing, but to create a pathway for genuine learning and repair. The Dignity Fund's criteria were written with the same practicality Helena had shown. It would provide emergency grants to employees in crisis, short-term loans for those facing catastrophic events, and micro-grants for local community projects that aligned with the bank's financial literacy mission. The Memorial Helena would begin as a small, simple display in the first branch: a photo, a short plaque with Helena's voice distilled into a single sentence about dignity, and a rotating exhibit highlighting community stories. On a clear Tuesday in early spring, the bank held its first Day of Humanity. Executives traded their suits for aprons and name tags. Priscilla served coffee at the branch where Benedito had once cut a ribbon. The photo of the old founders hummed softly on a small easel near the service counter. The day was clumsy in the way beginnings are clumsy. Executives stumbled over the simple motions of frontline service and discovered the small gifts of learning that only proximity can give. They stood in queues, helped organize documents, and in that proximity, they listened.
There were awkward apologies from staff who had been on the receiving end of the institution's old indifference, and there were honest conversations where managers admitted they had thought empathy was a soft skill and not a discipline. The dignity breakfasts were modest affairs where executives sat at staff tables and listened to stories of hardship and perseverance. Marcio, who had once prioritized cost savings like a mantra, cried openly in a small circle when an employee spoke about the fear of losing a home during a medical emergency. The bank's appetite for numerical certainty had met a human ledger that refused to be reduced. Camila found herself leading a training session. She spoke about small acts, how a customer's dignity could be preserved by a sentence, by a small willingness to slow down. She lacked the polish of a professional facilitator, but had the raw honesty of someone who had watched a man pick up brochures with patience and had felt the rightness of that motion. Not every response was immediate contrition. Some executives argued that the bank's core mission was financial stewardship and that too much focus on social programs would dilute returns. Roberto prayed, in his way, over spreadsheets. Could the bank afford the trust? Yet as the pilot branches implemented the Dignity Code, data began to shift in ways that surprised even the skeptics. Employee satisfaction surveys, co-designed with the independent auditor and the committee, registered incremental rises. Customer feedback showed fewer complaints about service scorn and longer notes of gratitude from clients who had been treated differently. Turnover slowed in pilot branches. The Dignity Fund, small at first, prevented several employees from dropping out of work during crises, preserving institutional knowledge and saving the bank hiring and training costs long term. Press coverage followed the pilot's early successes, not as a triumphalist headline, but in a more nuanced piece, an unsentimental examination of a large bank wrestling with its foundation. The headline noted that Excellence Bank had moved to implement reforms following the Founders Test. The article quoted Helena's letter and included a photo of the small Memorial Helena exhibit. Some readers applauded the bank's moral courage, others suspected PR. The Dignity Committee, mindful of performative traps, published quarterly audits with plain tables. Metrics included a reduction in reported dignity incidents, an increase in employee-rated respect scores, average time to resolution for dignity complaints, and funds dispersed to staff and community initiatives. Meanwhile, the human arcs continued to unfold in private ways. Joaquim, the delivery worker Benedito had helped, received a small emergency grant that allowed him to repair his bicycle and accept a steady route, reducing his financial precarity. Larissa, the receptionist, took a leading role in redesigning visitor protocols, insisting on a more generous policy for people who appeared without appointments, and a simple seating area with water and a small courtesy desk for those who needed assistance. Camila's promotion suggestions to create a permanent liaison role between internal operations and community outreach were adopted, and she became the coordinator of the Dignity Program, shepherding small projects. Priscilla did not become a paragon overnight. She had moments of relapse when the old habit of protecting optics returned with the subtlety of a reflex. But she also sat at staff tables, listened to stories of employees who had once been invisible, and wrote memos that requested time for difficult conversations. In a particularly raw meeting, she confessed to Benedito at his modest desk in a small community room after a public listening session that she had feared being weak. He listened without condescension. "You were protecting something you loved," he said, "but when love becomes a shield against kindness, it loses its purpose." Her apology this time held a different weight. It was anchored by action. She signed a public letter posted on the bank's site acknowledging her role and committing to the metrics the Dignity Committee had defined. She volunteered, publicly, to participate in restorative circles with employees who requested them. Not all adjustments were painless. Some managers left, unable to reconcile their styles with the bank's new requirements. The board accepted these transitions as part of cleaning the institution's moral ledger. The Dignity Committee found itself both a healing council and a disciplinary body. It recommended retraining for some and termination for a few where behavior had been repeated and remedial efforts failed. The committee's charter explicitly balanced compassion with accountability. As months turned into a year, measurable changes accumulated. Employee satisfaction rose by double digits in pilot branches and showed a modest but notable rise bank-wide. Complaints about dismissive service dropped. The bank's customer retention improved slightly. Trust metrics increased. Productivity stabilized, and in some departments improved. The board published a second annual report with an appendix dedicated to the Dignity Program's outcomes. The Memorial Helena small plaque now read, "For the dignity we owe one another, H.A." People left notes beside the photo, testimonies of small kindnesses, and stories of help. Benedito kept to his promise in another quiet way. He did not set himself up as an overseer. Instead, he attended listening sessions, sometimes incognito, sometimes openly. He watched a junior manager who had once been brusque become tender in a conversation with a long-serving teller who had been nearing retirement. He watched Priscilla serve coffee to a line of customers and laughed properly. He received letters from employees who had been helped by the fund, short notes of thanks that hit him like small good news. At the year's end, the bank held a modest ceremony in the first branch to dedicate the Memorial Helena. The event was neither a spectacle nor a PR stunt. It was a careful human gathering of employees at all levels, community members who had benefited from the new programs, and the Dignity Committee. Helena's photo was placed on a simple plinth. A plaque detailed the foundational commitments, the Dignity Program, the Day of Humanity, the Support Fund, and the independent audit process. Camilla read a short passage from Helena's letter as if reading an oath. Priscilla stood beside Benedito at the small reception line afterward. She reached for his hand in front of the gathered crowd, a public act that signaled a private, ongoing work. When she spoke into the microphone, her voice steadier than the first apology, she said, "We rediscovered something we had forgotten, that business must serve people, not the other way around. Today is not an end, it is a promise we intend to keep." The applause was soft but genuine. Some of the bank's external partners, clients who had once been purely transactional, came forward to shake Benedito's hand and to speak in their own words about the difference the changes had made. Journalists scribbled notes, but also recorded testimony from an elderly teller who had been with the bank for 30 years and now felt seen. In the months that followed the memorial, the Dignity Committee continued its audits. The third-party auditors published clear charts. Employee satisfaction had improved, retention in pilot branches rose, complaints declined in branches that had fully implemented the program. The support fund had helped dozens of employees weather crises, preventing immediate exits and preserving workplace experience. Shareholders, cautious at first, saw that a human-centered approach did not inevitably reduce profitability. Indeed, in some segments, customer loyalty improved. The transformation was not total. There were still stumbles and days when the old machine of efficiency leaned into its grooves. The Dignity Committee recommended continued training, more robust onboarding to embed the values, and a permanent position for a community liaison. The bank adjusted its executive reviews to include dignity metrics and leadership evaluations. A new clause in employment agreements emphasized the bank's commitment to respectful treatment and the consequences of violating those terms. The work proved to be institutionally sticky. Small policy changes, when enforced, created different routines and expectations. And Benedito, he kept walking his neighborhood, sometimes stopping by the first branch not to watch but to sit quietly and read. He had not returned for spectacle. His motive had always been fidelity to a promise. Helena's voice, contained in her neat script, had done the heavy moral labor of translation into institutional practice. He had been the means, but the real change required many hands, some guilty, some repentant, many willing. Near the end of the first year, Priscilla asked for a private meeting in a quieter room. She arrived with a cup of coffee in her hand and a folder of proposals. "People asked what I would do differently," she said. "They wanted more than words. I wanted to show them." He listened as she laid out new plans: a permanent dignity director role, a rotating community seat on the board, a mentorship program to advance employees from underrepresented neighborhoods, and a small annual allocation from profits for the Dignity Fund. She had been tested herself. Her humility now had the texture of someone learning how to be serviceable in public without losing initiative. Benedito smiled in a way that had little pomp. "You have done more than I hoped," he said, "not because you changed your public face, but because you have started to change the private decisions that add up to a culture." She paused. "I was ashamed at first," she admitted. "I thought power meant never showing that you were wrong. I understand now that leadership is a practice of repair." They spoke a while longer about small policy details and the need for patience. Benedito confessed in a low voice that Helena would have been pleased, not because a bank had changed, but because the promise she had made had not been forgotten. She believed institutions were like gardens. They need tending, and if you neglect the weeds of indifference, they take the whole thing. Months later, Benedito found himself in the bank's lobby less as an outsider than as a grandfatherly fixture. People greeted him without the earlier polish of social distance. He would occasionally stop to talk with a teller or to find Joachim, who now came to collect small deliveries with a steadier step. The lobby's marble remained pale, but the way people moved through it had softened. The story found a wider audience: a piece in a national journal, letters to the editor, commentary about leadership and what real commitment looks like. Some critics claimed the changes were publicity or that the bank's move would have happened anyway. But for those who knew the details, the employees who had been assisted by the fund, the managers who had been changed by restorative circles, and the small community projects aided by microgrants, the change was concrete and lived. Priscilla remained a complicated figure. She did not receive universal forgiveness. Some never forgot the splash of water, and she did not expect them to. But she continued to do the unsexy work of policy change, late-night training, and public accountability. Her arc was not a full absolution, but a slow, steady attempt to align action with apology. There were lessons beyond the bank's walls. Other institutions watched and adapted pieces of the Dignity Code. The idea that human dignity could be institutionalized into measurable practice caught on in some quarters. The language of metrics had shifted. CEOs began to include respect scores in their dashboards. Community committees were formed, and restorative practices moved from social services into corporate HR departments with a degree of awkwardness and hope. On a soft morning, months after the memorial, Benedito stood outside the branch where he had first placed his photograph on a bench. A small group had gathered to volunteer at a financial literacy clinic. He watched Priscilla instruct a young intern on how to greet a client who was frightened about a garnished account. He watched Camilla set up a table and explain microloans to a line of hopeful faces. He felt the gentle press of time, the way seeds, when tended, take root. A young executive who had been sent to observe the bank's changes approached him and said, a little shyly, "Sir, "Your test changed how we think of leadership." Benedito looked at the young man with no vanity. "It only worked because many hands did the work," he replied. "Promises need labor to be kept." At the bank's yearly gathering, the board announced a new scholarship program in Helena's name, aimed at supporting students from neighborhoods the bank had long ignored. The Memorial Helena had become a small pilgrimage site for employees. The Dignity Report of the year showed steady improvement, and a new clause: every year the bank would publish an independent audit of its dignity metrics as part of its annual report. When the tale of the water splashing reached broader audiences, the headline on one paper read with a shrill appetite, "Rich heir shamed him until who owned the bank was revealed." The headline searched for scandal. The fuller story, the one people living the change knew, was quieter and more complex. It was about a man who kept a promise to his spouse and about an institution that was forced to meet the mirror it had tried to avoid. Benedito never sought notoriety. His reward was smaller and more human. To see a teller treated with patience, to hear a manager acknowledge an error and then act to repair it, to receive a note from a former employee now living with a bit more stability because the fund had intervened in time. When people asked him about revenge or retribution, he would smile and say, "I have no appetite for either. I wanted fidelity to a promise." The bank's culture did not become perfect. Old habits still hovered like ghosts, but the structure to call those habits out existed now, and that made a difference. Policies, once only words, had been coupled with practices and oversight. The Dignity Committee continued its work. Its meetings, sometimes painful, sometimes triumphant. It recommended changes, stopped abuses, and financed small critical supports. In the end, the story was less about a single indignity delivered in a marble lobby and more about what followed, a seated commitment that demanded maintenance, humility, and the willingness to be accountable in public. On a late afternoon, as the light bent across the bank's glass and softened the day, Benedito sat on a bench outside the original branch and watched people come and go. He felt neither triumph nor bitterness, only the modest contentment of someone who had kept a promise to a woman who had loved him into better behavior. Before he rose to leave, a young woman, one of the scholarship recipients, approached him, clutching a small handwritten note. Her eyes were bright. "Mr. Andrade," she said, using the formal name that had once carried weight he had not desired, "thank you for not letting us be invisible." He took the paper and read the few lines. They were simple: gratitude for a chance, gratitude for being seen. He folded the note and placed it in his pocket next to a faded photograph of Helena. For a moment they both stood, two distant chapters connected by the present. As he walked away, his steps were quiet, as they had been in the first days of the test. The bank's lobby behind him hummed with ordinary business, a teller calling the next number, the clink of coins, a child's laugh. The marble remained pale, but the movement through it had changed incrementally in ways that would matter to the people whose lives would not make headlines. If there was a final accounting, it was settled not in the press, but in the small, steady proofs of changed practice. Fewer complaints, more people helped, a memorial plaque that reminded passersby of the work of one nurse who insisted on dignity, a fund that had saved families from precipitous collapse. The measures were not miraculous. They were human, contractual with time and attention. The bank, once a monument to success measured solely in profit, was learning to hold another ledger, one written in quiet acts of respect. Benedito had not come to reclaim power or to punish. He had come because Helena had asked him to remember their beginning and guard against forgetting. She had set a test that required proximity, and when the institution failed the simplest question, would you treat a human being with dignity at your own threshold, they had been given a chance to make it right. The city stretched beyond him. There were other banks, other institutions, other tests to be tried. But in one pale lobby, where a man had once been drenched with water in ignorance, something had changed because someone chose to keep a promise. If this story moves you, share it with someone who cares about dignity at work, and tell us, what one change would you demand at your workplace to make respect non-negotiable? Subscribe to follow more stories like this and to see how ordinary choices can alter institutions.